Jonah Hale only meant to stop for a minute when he saw a young woman standing beside a dead sedan on a rain-slicked road outside the city. He fixed a severed ignition wire, waved off her cash, and turned to leave without asking her name. But the woman pressed a folded note into his hand and told him to come to this address in the morning if he wanted to know who had sabotaged her car. Jonah went cold when he recognized the estate belonged to Celeste Kingsley, the guarded young chief executive he had quietly carried feelings for since long before either of them would admit it. And the person who opened the door the next morning was not the woman from the night before. If you want to know what that address was hiding, tap subscribe now and stay with the reveal that shook the entire Kingsley empire to its foundation. Jonah had been driving home from a long shift at the garage, still holding the sound of his daughter's voice on the phone, a promise that he would be home before she went to sleep. The road out past the edge of town was empty at that hour, rain coming down in a steady curtain that turned headlights into smears of white. He saw the sedan first, its hazard lights blinking weakly, and a young woman pacing beside it with her arms wrapped around herself. Cars had passed her by twice already without slowing, and Jonah eased his truck onto the shoulder before he had fully decided to stop. The woman introduced herself as Tessa Ward, her voice clipped with the particular impatience of someone who was cold, frightened, and trying not to show either. Her phone had died an hour earlier and the car's electrical system had gone with it, dashboard dark, engine refusing even a click. Jonah popped the hood and worked by the light of his own phone, running his fingers along the wiring harness out of habit more than hope. Within a minute he understood this was not ordinary failure. A control line near the ignition module had been cut clean, not torn or frayed by wear, but sliced with a precision tool by someone who knew exactly where a single incision would strand a car without causing a crash on the highway. He spliced the line well enough to get her moving again, then told her plainly that she should not drive it far until a shop could inspect the whole harness. Tessa reached for her wallet, but Jonah shook his head and told her the debt wasn't owed to him, it was owed to whoever had put a blade to her car in the first place. As he closed the hood and stepped back toward his truck, Tessa's eyes caught the small embroidered patch on his jacket, and something in her posture shifted, sharpened, the way a person looks when a stray fact suddenly clicks into place. She asked his name again, slower this time, as if she wanted to be certain she had heard it correctly. Before he could answer, she was already writing something on a torn corner of paper from her glove box. She told him to bring the severed wire, exactly as it was, to an address across town at 9 the following morning. Jonah asked why, and Tessa only looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite place, something between relief and disbelief. "The person who lives at this address," she told him, "has been looking for you far longer than you think." Then she drove off into the rain before he could ask a single follow-up question, leaving him standing on the shoulder, holding a scrap of paper and a length of deliberately cut wire. Jonah almost threw the note away twice before morning. He had spent 3 years building a quiet, uncomplicated life around his small garage and his daughter, and he had no interest in whatever wealthy drama waited behind an address like the one scrawled in Tessa's handwriting. But the cut wire sat on his workbench all night like an accusation, too clean, too intentional, too much like the kind of sabotage a man doesn't stumble into by accident. By morning the curiosity had won out over the caution, and he drove across town to a neighborhood of gated properties and manicured hedges he hadn't set foot in for years. The house at the address was the Kingsley estate, a property he recognized instantly from business magazines and city galas he had never attended. He almost turned the truck around in the driveway. Instead, the door opened before he could decide, and Celeste Kingsley stood on the other side of it, not in the tailored suits the press photographed her in, but in a plain sweater with her hair loose, looking more startled than he had ever seen her look in a boardroom. For a long moment neither of them spoke, 3 years of unfinished history sitting heavy in the space between the threshold and the porch step. Celeste recovered first, though her voice carried none of its usual boardroom composure. She asked how he had gotten this address, and before Jonah could answer, Tessa appeared behind her, apologizing rapid-fire for handing it out without asking permission first. It was only then that Jonah learned Tessa was Celeste's younger half-sister, a fact she had kept quiet by using her mother's maiden name to avoid the attention that came with being a Kingsley. Celeste turned on her sister with visible frustration, demanding to know why she would give a stranger the address to their childhood home without so much as a phone call first. Jonah cut through the sibling argument by setting the severed wire on the entry table between them. The mood in the room changed instantly, Celeste anger draining into something more careful and alert. He explained that whoever cut this line knew the exact architecture of a security system that had never been released to the public, a detail that made the sabotage look less like a random act of vandalism and more like the work of someone with inside knowledge. Celeste picked up the wire, turned it over once in her fingers, and confirmed what Jonah already suspected, that the sedan belonged to a small experimental fleet reserved for Kingsley Mobility's top executives. Tessa admitted, quietly this time, that she had borrowed Celeste's car the previous evening without telling anyone. If Celeste had been the one behind the wheel that night, instead of her sister, the real target of the sabotage might have been the chief executive herself. Jonah felt the pull to walk away from whatever internal Kingsley conflict this was becoming, a company he had left behind on principle and never intended to return to. Celeste stopped him at the door with a single sentence that landed harder than she probably intended, telling him the security architecture in that car had been built from a design he had drawn himself, years before he had ever walked out of Kingsley's offices for the last time. 3 years earlier, Jonah had been the lead safety engineer overseeing the electronic control systems for every vehicle in the Kingsley Mobility fleet. He had discovered a critical vulnerability buried in the remote control architecture, a flaw that under specific conditions would allow a vehicle's steering and braking systems to be overridden from an outside signal. He brought the finding directly to the board, requesting a full production halt until the flaw could be patched, but the executives balked at a delay that would cost the company hundreds of millions of dollars in contracts already signed. Preston Ashcroft, then vice chairman of the board, pressured Jonah to sign a report certifying the system as safe, telling him privately that engineers who couldn't read a balance sheet had no business slowing down a launch. Jonah refused to sign, even knowing exactly what it would cost him. His wife had died only months earlier, leaving him to raise their daughter Nora alone, and every part of his financial situation told him to keep his head down and take the paycheck. He couldn't do it. He resigned within the week, walked away from the only career he had built, and opened a small roadside garage where the only person he had to answer to was himself, and, eventually, his daughter. The weeks after he left were the hardest of his life, harder even than the funeral had been, because grief at least came with people around him, while resignation came with silence. Former colleagues stopped calling within a month, unwilling to be seen associating with a man the board had quietly labeled difficult. He took whatever work he could find, patching transmissions and replacing brake lines out of a rented bay behind a tire shop, teaching himself the parts of the trade that engineering school had never covered. Nora was barely old enough to understand what had changed, only that her father came home smelling like motor oil instead of the cologne he used to wear to the office, and that the two of them ate dinner earlier now because there was no longer anyone keeping him late. He never told her the real reason he had left Kingsley, not because he was ashamed of it, but because he didn't want her carrying the weight of a decision that had been entirely his to make. What he did tell her Over and over in the small ways parents repeat the lessons that matter most, was that some things cost more to keep quiet about than they cost to lose entirely. She was young enough then that the words probably meant less to her than the tone in which he said them, steady and certain in a way that nothing else in their lives had been at the time. Celeste had been chief operating officer at the time, without the authority to overrule the board, but with enough foresight to quietly copy every page of Jonah's original report before it disappeared into a locked file. Jonah had always assumed she chose the company and the profit margins over the truth, the same as everyone else in that boardroom, and he had cut off every line of contact the moment he cleared out his desk. What he never knew was that after she was named chief executive, Celeste had used his original report to force a silent recall of the flawed system, replacing it piece by piece without ever publicizing the failure or the man who had first raised the alarm. She had sent him letters for 2 years asking him to return in some capacity, and every single one had gone straight into a drawer, unread, because he assumed they were simply the company trying to buy his silence with a better title. In the present, standing in her entryway with the cut wire between them, Celeste asked Jonah to come on as an independent technical investigator, someone outside the company's chain of command who could look at the sabotage without political pressure clouding the findings. Jonah agreed, but only under 3 conditions he laid out without hesitation. He wanted full access to every piece of relevant data without restriction, complete independence from anyone attempting to shape his conclusions, and a guarantee that if he found any ongoing risk to customers, Kingsley would disclose it publicly, regardless of the cost. Celeste agreed before he had finished the 3rd condition, a speed that surprised him more than it should have. When Jonah examined the control module recovered from the sedan, he found that the disabling command had not been triggered by hand at all. It had been transmitted remotely using what engineers on the original team called a master key, a signal capable of overriding any vehicle in the executive fleet from a distance. Only 3 such master keys existed within the entire company. One belonged to the Internal Security Division. One was assigned directly to the chief executive's own credentials. The 3rd was managed out of Preston Ashcroft's office, a detail that made Jonah's stomach tighten the moment he saw it printed on the access log. Jonah went to Kingsley Mobility's headquarters the following day to examine the server logs firsthand, and his presence drew immediate attention. He arrived in his garage jacket among executives in tailored suits, and more than one head turned as he walked past the glass-walled conference rooms toward the security office. Preston Ashcroft entered not long after, feigning surprise at seeing him, before deliberately referring to him within earshot of half the floor as the roadside mechanic. Jonah didn't rise to it, though the remark landed exactly as intended. Ashcroft pressed further in the open meeting, openly questioning Celeste's judgment for handing the company's security investigation to a man who, in his words, had to fix cars to make his rent. He went further still, invoking the fact that Jonah was raising a daughter alone, implying that a man in his position would be easy enough to buy if the price were right. Jonah didn't raise his voice. He only asked Ashcroft, calmly, how a vice chairman happened to know so much about the private finances of an ordinary mechanic he claimed never to think about, and the question knocked Ashcroft off balance just long enough for the room to notice. Digging through the access records, Jonah found a login trail showing Celeste's own credentials had issued the disabling command to the sedan. The timestamp placed her in the middle of a crowded fundraising gala, her laptop sitting untouched in a locked private conference room the entire evening. Graham Wexler, the company's head of security and a former federal investigator, suggested her account credentials had likely been stolen rather than misused, but Ashcroft seized on the discrepancy to demand her immediate suspension in the name of protecting shareholders. Jonah found the whole trail suspicious in its own right, too tidy, too perfectly aimed at Celeste, like evidence staged for an investigator to find exactly where it wanted him to look. Before leaving the server room that evening, Jonah noticed something almost buried in the metadata. A discrepancy in the command's timestamp of exactly 47 seconds. It was a signature manipulation technique he recognized from an old security contractor once retained by Ashcroft Capital, a company Preston's own family fortune had built from the ground up. The realization didn't clear Celeste's name outright, but it planted the first real seed of doubt about who was actually behind the sabotage, and it pointed, however faintly, back toward the man loudest about her guilt. Tessa later explained why she had come back into the city in the first place, beyond simply borrowing her sister's car. After their mother's death, she had inherited an 8% ownership stake in Kingsley Mobility, a stake small enough to seem insignificant until it became the deciding block in an upcoming shareholder vote on a proposed merger with Ashcroft Capital. Ashcroft had approached her more than once with generous offers to buy out her shares outright, and each time she refused, the offers were followed by anonymous messages warning her to reconsider. Celeste wanted to bring in the police immediately, but Tessa was afraid someone inside their own family security detail had already been compromised by Ashcroft's money. The sabotaged sedan, Jonah realized, had been a warning wrapped in an accident. Either Tessa sold her shares quietly, or the next disabled vehicle wouldn't stop with a stranded car on a rainy shoulder. When he examined the cut wire more closely under a bench light, he found a microchip no larger than a grain of rice embedded inside the insulation, small enough to escape casual inspection, but sophisticated enough to mirror the signal of the company's master key. The chip had been manufactured by a small subsidiary buried 3 layers deep in Ashcroft Capital's investment portfolio, a connection that took a full afternoon of digging to confirm. Even with the chip traced back to Ashcroft's network, Jonah still lacked anything that placed Preston's own hands on the sabotage itself. A man with his resources could always claim a subordinate had acted alone, or that the device had been stolen from one of his subsidiaries without his knowledge. Celeste wanted to move Tessa somewhere safer immediately, but Jonah cautioned against any sudden disruption to their routines. Worried that a visible change would tip off whoever was watching, that the investigation had come too close for comfort. While the two of them debated the safest next step, Tessa watched the exchange with the quiet, knowing look of someone noticing something neither of them was saying aloud. She asked Jonah, almost offhandedly, whether he knew that Celeste still kept the original safety report he had written 3 years earlier, framed and displayed where only she would see it. Jonah admitted he had no idea. Tessa told him Celeste had circled one line in particular and had it printed above her desk, a sentence about how no company deserved to survive if its customers had to pay the price for its leadership's silence. It was in that moment, watching Jonah's expression shift, that Tessa understood exactly why she had recognized his name written across his jacket on the roadside 2 nights earlier. The fragile progress of that afternoon was interrupted by a message that arrived on Tessa's phone from an unknown number, containing only a single-line warning that the mechanic would be the next thing destroyed. Because headquarters could no longer be trusted as a safe place to work, Jonah and Celeste relocated their review of the data to a private study inside the Kingsley estate, away from the network and the eyes that came with it. Without the boardroom around her, Celeste's guarded composure softened by degrees Jonah hadn't expected, and he noticed for the first time how large and quiet the house felt for someone who so rarely seemed to eat a meal there with anyone else. Celeste admitted that after Jonah left the company, she had used his original report as leverage to force a silent recall of the flawed system, replacing every vulnerable unit without ever publicly naming the man who had first raised the alarm. She hadn't done it to protect the company's reputation. She told him, but to protect him from being dragged through a legal fight with a board that would have buried him along with the truth. Jonah had spent 3 years believing that silence was proof she had chosen the company over honesty, and hearing the real reason behind it didn't erase the hurt so much as complicate it. Celeste apologized plainly for making that decision on his behalf, without ever giving him the choice to make it himself. Jonah, in turn, admitted he had never opened a single one of the letters she sent inviting him back, certain they were nothing more than a corporate attempt to purchase his silence with a better title and a bigger salary. He told her he used to see the return address on the envelope and set it aside without even breaking the seal, telling himself it was easier not to know what was inside than to face the possibility that it might have actually mattered. Celeste listened without interrupting, and for the first time since he'd known her, she looked less like the woman who ran a company, and more like someone who had spent years quietly wondering whether she had made an unforgivable mistake. The tension between them eased into something gentler as the evening wore on, less accusation and more the slow work of two people finally saying things they had rehearsed for years and never spoken aloud. She told him about the framed line from his old report, admitting she had read it every morning before walking into meetings where she had to defend decisions she didn't always believe in. Jonah asked her, quietly, why she had never simply picked up the phone and told him any of this herself instead of hiding it behind formal letters and secondhand recalls. Celeste answered that she was afraid of exactly what was happening now, that hearing it from her would only make him feel managed instead of respected, one more decision made about his life without his consent. Celeste came close to admitting how she truly felt, then stopped herself, unwilling to let it look like she was using his help as leverage for something more personal. Jonah noticed the hesitation and didn't push her to finish the sentence, understanding instinctively that some things needed to be earned back slowly, rather than said all at once under the pressure of a crisis. Just as they uncovered an encrypted file buried in a backup drive, Graham called with news that security had received an authorization to search Jonah's garage. Inside a locked tool cabinet, the search team found the company's missing master key device, along with a partial backup of customer data that had no reason to be there. Jonah insisted furiously that neither item had ever belonged to him and that someone had planted them deliberately. Ashcroft moved fast, issuing an internal memo before the sun rose the next morning that painted Jonah as a bitter former employee returning to extort the company that had once let him go. Within a single news cycle, the man who had spent 3 days trying to protect Kingsley's customers had become, in the eyes of the public, the very threat he was investigating. The story leaked to the press within hours, and by morning Jonah was being described across local outlets as a failed mechanic attempting to shake down his former employer. Reporters who had never once asked to speak with him during his years of quiet, honest work at the garage suddenly wanted quotes, camping outside the shop with cameras and microphones, until he finally posted a handwritten sign on the door asking them to leave his customers alone. Customers who had trusted the garage with their vehicles for years began quietly canceling appointments, and a bank that had approved his loan for an expansion suddenly put the funding on indefinite hold. An old friend from his engineering days sent a brief, awkward message wishing him luck, careful not to say anything that could be read as taking a side. Jonah didn't blame him for it. He understood better than most how quickly a reputation could be rebuilt into a weapon once the right person decided to point it at someone. Nora asked him only once whether the things people were saying about him were true, her voice careful in the way of a teenager, trying not to show how frightened she really was. Jonah didn't give her the details. He only told her that she didn't need to believe what strangers were saying, only what he had spent her whole life teaching her about telling the truth even when it cost something. Nora told him she believed him, and the conversation ended there, brief and quiet, the way he wanted it to stay. Under mounting pressure from Ashcroft, the board demanded Celeste sever all ties with Jonah immediately, and Ashcroft made it clear that continuing to defend him publicly would cost her the support she needed to keep her seat as chief executive. Ashcroft arranged a private meeting with Jonah and laid out an offer with the practiced ease of a man used to buying his way out of problems. If Jonah would confess to stealing the device, take the blame publicly, and quietly leave the city, the more serious charges would disappear, and his garage's outstanding debts would simply vanish. Ashcroft assumed, wrongly, that a single father with a struggling business would choose financial safety over his own name. Jonah refused without a second of hesitation, telling him plainly that he had misjudged what people without money actually have to protect. After the meeting, a detail surfaced in Jonah's memory that he had nearly overlooked: the manufacturing code stamped into the recovered master key device, which showed a production date, more than 6 months after he had already left the company. It was proof, simple and undeniable, that he could never have stolen a device that didn't yet exist on the day he walked out of Kingsley's doors for good. The manufacturing records that would have confirmed it, however, had already been scrubbed from the company's internal database. Around the same time, Tessa stopped answering her phone entirely, and the family's lawyer announced that she had voluntarily left the city for her own safety, a story Jonah refused to believe for even a moment. Just before going silent, Tessa had sent him one last message, a blurred photograph of the sedan's dashboard, along with a single instruction to zoom into the lower right corner of the frame. It was the only lead he had left, and he intended to follow it before anyone else could bury it the way they had buried everything else. When Jonah enlarged the photograph on his laptop, he found a small diagnostic code embedded in the dashboard display, a feature he had secretly written into the original prototype years earlier to trace remote commands back to their source. Every override command logged not just the account used to send it, but a unique digital fingerprint tied to the physical device that issued the signal. The current version of the security system had scrubbed that data from its official reports, but a temporary cache still lived deep in the vehicle's own onboard memory, untouched by whoever had cleaned up the rest of the trail. Graham quietly helped Jonah gain access to the sedan again, because by then even he had begun to suspect the official investigation had been steered toward a predetermined conclusion. Together they recovered the fingerprint, and it traced the override command to a device registered on the executive floor of Ashcroft Capital's own offices. That same device had connected briefly to Celeste's laptop while it sat unattended in the locked conference room, finally explaining how her credentials had been used without her knowledge. Tessa resurfaced not long after, unharmed, revealing that she hadn't been taken anywhere at all, but had quietly played along with the lawyer's arrangement in order to recover a tablet that had been confiscated from her earlier. On it was a backup of dashcam footage that had somehow survived the original data wipe. The footage showed, unmistakably, a technician employed by Ashcroft's private security contractor approaching the sedan in the hour before Tessa ever got behind the wheel that night. Marin Cole, the company's chief counsel, reviewed the recovered chain of evidence and confirmed it would hold up both before the board and in front of any outside investigator who eventually got involved. But the clock was no longer on their side. Ashcroft had already called an emergency board session for the following morning, intending to suspend Celeste from her position, push through the merger with Ashcroft Capital, and transfer effective control of the entire company into his own hands before anyone could stop him. Jonah wanted to release everything they had immediately, but Celeste refused, warning that Ashcroft would have every opportunity to erase the remaining trail and dismiss the footage as manufactured if they moved too soon. She wanted him to walk into that boardroom fully confident of his victory, and then close every possible exit at once, before he had the chance to talk his way free. It meant putting her own position, and the Kingsley family name along with it, entirely into the hands of a man the board had spent the last few days dismissing as nothing more than a roadside mechanic. Celeste made the choice anyway, and told Jonah she trusted him more than she had trusted anyone in that boardroom in years. The conference room the next morning was filled with the company's largest shareholders, and Ashcroft entered with the easy confidence of a man certain Celeste no longer had the votes to keep her seat. He framed Jonah's involvement as proof that Celeste had allowed personal feelings to compromise her judgment as chief executive, letting a former employee wander freely through confidential company data. When Jonah walked in, still wearing his garage jacket among the tailored suits around the table, a few board members didn't even bother to hide their amusement. Ashcroft asked, loudly enough for the room to hear, what standing a mechanic possibly had to speak in a meeting deciding a deal worth billions of dollars. Jonah set the tampered master key device on the table and read its manufacturing date aloud without raising his voice. Marin confirmed publicly that the device had been produced well after Jonah's departure from the company, making the accusation that he had stolen it years earlier a physical impossibility. Graham followed with a recovered digital fingerprint tracing the override signal, and Tessa played the dashcam footage for the entire room to see. Ashcroft tried to argue that a rogue security employee could have acted entirely on his own, without any direction from above. Jonah pressed further, laying out the login history, showing the same device had been used repeatedly from a personal workstation inside Ashcroft's own private office. He watched several board members lean forward as the timeline unfolded on the screen behind him, the same executives who had laughed when he first walked into the room, now sitting in complete silence. One of the older shareholders, a woman who had sat on the board since before Celeste was born, asked Ashcroft directly whether he had any explanation for a device registered under his own office appearing in the chain of custody at all. He had none that satisfied her, and the silence that followed said more than any answer could have. Celeste didn't raise her voice either. She simply asked Ashcroft, evenly, why a security contractor under his direct control had sabotaged the very car her sister happened to be driving days before a shareholder vote that hinged on her sister's stake. Tessa stood and announced, for the record, that she was keeping every share she owned and voting against the merger outright, and with that single sentence, the majority Ashcroft believed he had secured collapsed entirely in front of him. In one last attempt to salvage the room, Ashcroft accused Jonah of only helping Celeste to buy himself a return to power and a paycheck he clearly needed. Jonah answered him without flinching, telling him plainly that he had turned down Ashcroft's money once already when he had nothing left to lose, and he wasn't about to sell himself now that he was holding the truth. It was in that moment, with the room finally turning against him, that Jonah revealed one more thing Ashcroft had never accounted for, a legal claim still in his name that could unravel the entire merger before it ever reached a signature. Jonah produced the original development agreement from his years designing the company's safety architecture, a contract Kingsley had used for years without ever completing the final transfer of certification rights. Because he had resigned before the system received formal regulatory approval, the authority to certify the remote control safety protocol as fit for public use had technically remained his the entire time. Ashcroft had planned to fold that very technology into the valuation of his merger without ever securing Jonah's legal consent to use it. If Jonah refused to grant certification now, the deal would lose a significant portion of its projected value and open the company to a federal inquiry into financial misrepresentation. Ashcroft had assumed from the very beginning that a man running a small roadside garage would be easy enough to buy off with a generous number. He never anticipated that the same man had quietly held onto real leverage for 3 years and simply chosen, out of principle, never to use it for personal gain. Jonah laid out his conditions plainly to the room. The company would publicly disclose the technical vulnerability in full. Every vehicle at risk would receive a free inspection and repair. The engineers who had been pressured into silence during the original cover-up would be formally protected from retaliation, and the sabotage investigation itself would be handed over to an outside authority with no ties to Kingsley's internal chain of command. Celeste accepted every condition without a single moment of negotiation. The board voted to suspend Ashcroft on the spot and terminated the proposed merger before lunch, freezing the relevant accounts pending a full external review. Security escorted him from the building quietly, no shouting, no scene, just a man walking out of a room he had entered that morning believing he already owned it. Before he stepped through the doors for the last time, he turned back to Jonah and asked, almost bitterly, why a man with that much leverage would choose to spend his life fixing cars in a small garage instead of using it. Jonah answered him simply, telling him that power only meant something when a person knew exactly when not to sell it. In the weeks that followed, Jonah's reputation was fully restored, forcing the outlets that had painted him as a fraud to issue quiet corrections. His old customers returned to the garage one by one, some of them apologizing for doubting him in the first place. Celeste offered him the position of Chief Safety Officer at Kingsley Mobility, complete with a substantial salary and real authority within the company. Jonah turned it down, unwilling to tie his future or Nora's entirely to the fortunes of a single corporation ever again. Instead, the two of them worked out something closer to an equal partnership, an independent inspection group that would work alongside Kingsley without ever answering to it, free to publish its findings without needing the chief executive's approval. Celeste accepted the arrangement because she finally understood what Jonah actually needed from her wasn't rescue, it was respect on equal footing. After the papers were signed, she admitted, quietly and without any of her usual composure, that she had cared for him for years before any of this began. Not because of what he owned or what he had once saved the company from, but because of what he had been willing to lose to protect people who never even knew his name. Jonah didn't answer with a declaration of his own. He told her honestly that whatever trust had existed between them years ago had been broken once already, and that rebuilding it would take real time rather than a single grand gesture. Celeste asked, almost shyly for someone who ran a multi-billion-dollar company, whether dinner was moving too fast for that kind of rebuilding. Jonah smiled and suggested they start with something smaller than dinner, maybe just coffee, and let the rest follow at its own pace. Tessa admitted, not long after, that she had given him the address that first night because she knew her sister would never have the courage to seek him out herself outside the walls of an office. Jonah asked what she would have done if he hadn't shown up the next morning after all. Tessa answered without missing a beat that she had already been planning to disable a second car, if that's what it took to get his attention. Celeste laughed then, freely, for what Jonah realized might have been the first time he had heard her laugh at all since this entire ordeal began. A season later, Kingsley Mobility completed a full inspection and upgrade of every vehicle affected by the original flaw. Jonah's independent inspection group had grown into an organization other companies sought out on their own, though the garage itself stayed exactly where it had always been, the same faded sign still hanging above the door. Nora, appearing only briefly in these final days, teased her father that Celeste seemed to visit the shop far more often than any routine safety check would ever require. Jonah didn't bother denying it. Celeste slowly learned to show up in Jonah's life without the trappings of her title, arriving in an ordinary car instead of a chauffeured one, carrying her own coffee instead of sending someone ahead to bring it. What grew between them wasn't built on a single dramatic proposal or a sweeping public gesture, but on quiet evenings spent going over paperwork together, honest conversations, and the simple willingness to admit when either of them had been wrong. There were still disagreements, small ones about scheduling, and larger ones about how quickly the new inspection program should expand. And both of them had learned by then that disagreeing openly was safer than the silence that had once cost them 3 years they couldn't get back. Tessa kept her shares, choosing to lead the company's new ethics oversight program rather than remain quietly in the shadow of a family name that had never fully belonged to her. She visited the garage often enough that Nora began teasing her too, calling her the only Kingsley who actually knew how to check her own oil. Graham stayed on as head of security, though he privately admitted to Jonah one afternoon that he intended to retire within the year, tired of a job that had nearly cost an innocent man his reputation before the truth finally caught up. Marin's office quietly rewrote the company's internal reporting policies so that no engineer would ever again be asked to sign away a safety concern just to protect a launch date. One afternoon, Jonah found the original torn scrap of paper Tessa had handed him that first rainy night, still tucked in the back of a drawer in the garage. He pressed it into a small frame and hung it in the office, and Celeste asked why he'd bothered keeping something so crumpled and ordinary. He told her that some addresses only lead a person to a house, but every so often one leads a person back to a part of their own life they thought had already been lost for good. Celeste looked at him and asked whether he had come that first morning to investigate a broken car or to find her. Jonah smiled and told her that when he arrived, all he wanted to know was who had cut the wire. By the time he left, he was already wondering who had quietly put the rest of his life back together. The story closed on the two of them locking up the garage together at dusk, the very sedan that had once been sabotaged now fully repaired and parked out front, a quiet reminder that something can be tampered with, stopped, and left for dead on the side of the road, and still find its way back to running exactly as it should.